Hi everyone, it's Paul. In this clip we're going to look at groups of benign cells that look like high-grade SIL. Just to remind you what the crowded hyperchromatic groups of high SIL look like. They have nuclear abnormalities, so hyperchromasia, variation, size and shape, irregular nuclear membranes. But the groups themselves also lack polarity, so the nuclei point in all different directions, they look disorganized, very crowded. That's because of the high NC ratio. And around the outside you can usually see the centrally placed nuclei, and the edges are quite ragged, so you don't have a smooth community border at all. So the first obvious thing that looks like that are groups, large groups of immature squamous cells. This is a case of atrophy. These are parabasal cells. Notice how much blander the nuclei look, so they have fine, even chromatin. And if you look at the sort of long axis of all the nuclei, they're pointing pretty much in the same direction, so they have good polarity. Around the edge you can see nuclei quite well spaced, reflecting the fact that they're not very high NC ratio. And if you look at the nuclei in the middle of the group, then you can see that they have only a couple of nuclei deep. This is probably a harder example. This is atrophy as well, and these are quite hyperchromatic looking groups of parabasal cells. In this case you can see, especially around the edge, the nuclei are quite well spaced, so that reflects the fact that they have an adequate amount of cytoplasm. The NC ratio is not too high. And if we look on higher power, you can see there is pretty good organization in here. Maybe less so than the last group, but not a lot of depth of focus, so I can only focus through really 2 layers of nuclei. Out on the edge, the NC ratio is okay for squamous cells, and they're definitely squamoid. They've got central nuclei. Often you can match the cells in these groups back to single parabasal cells and correlate with the clinical history that it's a postmenopausal patient. Now, groups get harder when they get a bit reactive, so this is actually a case of reactive metaplasia. So these are immature squamous cells. You can see the nuclei are looking more fired up, I guess, more excited. Maybe little nucleoli in quite a few of them. They're slightly enlarged, but again they have quite an adequate amount of NC of cytoplasm. The cell depth is not there either, so we've only got really a flat sheet of 1 nuclei, maybe in places 2 nuclei deep. Chromatin is actually a little granular, and I think that's partly a degenerate change, but there is not too much variation in size and shape here, and it just looks organized. This is another group in a fairly mature background, so superficial and intermediate cells there. These I think are reactive endocervical cells, so this probably you could call repair. There's prominent nucleoli in nearly all of the nuclei. The cytoplasm seems a lot less dense, but again notice that the chromatin is not hyperchromatic. It's quite bland, and the nuclei are a little crowded here, but they're not really overlapping in a disorganized fashion, especially when you can see the cells like this around the edges. You can see they have quite a bit of cytoplasm. The other gland cells that can be tricky are endometrial cells, because they form 3-dimensional disorganized looking groups of cells that have a very high NC ratio. Notice, however, the uniformity of the nuclear size and shape in this group of endometrials, and they're all the same size or smaller than these intermediate nuclei. Around the edges they don't have very much cytoplasm, and certainly not looking squamoid. Another area that's very tricky and a lot less common is follicular cervicitis, so when you get artifactually clumped groups of lymphocytes. This is an example of that, and this looks really like a crowded hyperchromatic group with high NC ratio, so it's quite tricky. What you have to recognise here is the very small size, hard to compare here, I don't have an intermediate, and the very round shape to all of the nuclei, and quite a bit of variation maybe in size, but none of these will be terribly large, and the chromatin will not be terribly coarse, even though they're very hyperchromatic in this case. This is tricky, and often you'll have to look for a group of cells around that are more obviously lymphoid in nature. And this is an example of those here. You can see them next to an intermediate nucleus. They're quite small, and they're definitely very round cells with a small rim of cytoplasm around them. So in summary, high-grade SIL can be mimicked by other cells that form groups of cells, and that includes immature squamous cells, obviously squamous metaplasia, atrophy where you have large sheets sometimes of parabasal cells. Endocervical cells can be tricky, particularly when they're reactive and they've got a bit of nuclear enlargement and variation and hyperchromasia. Endometrial cells can be tricky because they normally form three-dimensional groups that are fairly disorganized. And lymphocytes sometimes can clump together and look like crowded hyperchromatic groups. So it's important, one, to identify nuclear abnormalities, and variation in nuclear size and shape is very helpful in this regard, hyperchromasia, coarse chromatin, and then look at the architecture of the group. So does it have depth of focus of greater than 2 nuclei? Is it showing poor polarity, overlapping disorganization? Is there squamous features around the edges? So make sure that they've got that well-defined cell border. And finally, correlate with clinical notes. So for example, if it was a postmenopausal patient, then you need to think of the fact that it might be atrophy present. If you're suspecting that it could be endometrial cells, then look for a bloody background, look for a mature background, and look for the last menstrual period being within the last 10 days.